Booktube. I'm back for another set of books. I had mentioned them briefly again with the Samuel Johnson set, but I showed most of them, if not all of them, with the Coffee Houses and Rabbit Holes, and this is the British Essayists. My edition is in 5 volumes. That's volume 1. It's a bit rough around the edges. They're 3/4 leather corners, but the paper is peeling in places. And I've got all volumes here. Let's hold up the others, I guess. They're in pretty good shape for the most part. They're from 1828. And the first volume's a bit rickety, so I don't want to handle it too much. The first volume comprises The Spectator, which I do have in another edition, so I can dispense with that one if I need to for handling it. Now, it consists, as I say, this is the... there's various frontispieces for each periodical. I'll show that in a moment, but the whole Essayists was done originally in 1817 by Alexander Chalmers. It eventually went to 45 volumes. It comprises the complete runs of periodical literature of Spectator, Toddler, Guardian, Rambler, Idler, Adventurer, Connoisseur, Mirror, Lounger, World, Observer, Knox's Essays, Ola, Perdita, and Microcosm. Those last 3 were not in the 45 volumes. They've been added to this one, and I think 1 or 2 minor ones were taken out. I'm not 100% sure why at this point. I've not chased that up. But there's the title page. The light's not the best. But this is the volume 2, and they all have their little engravings, and this is of Sir Richard Steele engraving, and it's the Toddler and the Guardian in 1 volume. And my edition here is the University edition, so it's 2 columns, smallish print. And yeah, it comprises everything, because the other volumes, the 45 volumes, are a little smaller, I think, in size, but the print is much, much larger, so we're talking a good 5 pages per page on mine, at least, and there are 1,000 pages each, these. But I named them off, and it starts with The Spectator, and that's the first volume. I think because it's considered the best of the time, or was, even though the Toddler came before. So we'll start with the Toddler, and I'll go through each of them, not specifically in chronological order as they appeared, but to a large extent it will. The Toddler was done by Richard Steele. Started in 1709. It went for 2 years. It was 3 times weekly. And we saw this again in the Coffee Houses and Rabbit Holes. Steele set himself up as a fictitious observer, journalist called Isaac Bickerstaff, who went to coffee houses. And there was 2 or 3 that he haunted regularly. He just wrote down what he said was sort of the gossip and the stories that he heard, but to a large part, a lot was made up. It consisted of literary items. Because they would discuss literary poetry, some of the coffee houses, politics, science, and it went for 2 years. And then he disbanded it and started with Joseph Addison, The Spectator, which is in the first volume, and that went from 1711 to 1712. And that was daily. That was a daily essay of 2,500 words long. It was reprised in 1714 for 6 months. but that was done 3 times per week. I think it was 3 times per week. And here's from I have, as I say, another edition of it. And it's the Everyman edition, and this was included with it. It's basically one facsimile of one of the issues. This is 183 in Roman numerals. Now, I'm not 100% sure if it's the same size. I'm kind of thinking this is shrunk down a little bit, but it's just it's just one page, both sides. And it just continued the ethos of the Toddler, just stories that were going on about literature, all aimed at middle class readers, bringing books, describing books, a bit of book reviewing when that was in its infancy, talking about libraries, science, nature, just everything, poetry, politics. Occasionally there's delving into politics, and humorous type essays just on specific subjects. And it is considered to be the best collection of essays of the time. And if you pick up any, and I stress the word any, collection of English essays that goes back from the beginning, it'll have Bacon for sure, and it will have Joseph Addison's and Richard Steele's excerpts from the Spectator and the Toddler. It's just a given. It will, and as well as Johnson. They can't leave those out because of the influence of those. You can argue possibly there were better ones, but that's another argument at the time. But you cannot deny the influence of these on later generations. Now, then we go on to The Guardian, which was a newspaper. It was in 1713, March to October. Various contributors. Addison contributed to it. It was short-lived, but it was a pre-runner of the Gentleman's Magazine, which lasted from sort of early mid 18th century right up into the 1920s. And here's a bit of a digression, but it's a book person's fish story. In this case, the one that got away. Local bookseller got a huge run, some ex-library and some not, of the Gentleman's Magazine. It could have comprised a good part of all the 18th century and 19th century volumes, issues, and just couldn't do it. The price was good, but just couldn't do it. So I think they're mostly all gone now. Now, the Guardian, many may recognize the name Guardian. It's not the Guardian newspaper. I don't believe it has any connection other than just the name, because the Guardian newspaper is the Manchester Guardian, which was started after the Peterloo massacre from Manchester, and sometime in the 1820s, I think it started. Then we go on to the Rambler, and that we covered with Samuel Johnson, because he wrote this every Tuesday and Saturday from 1750 to 52, an essay every edition, while the other ones, like Toddler and Spectator, were written in sort of colloquial language and sort of everyday language. Johnson wrote in a more heightened style, more academic writing, and even though the others were aimed at middle class, his was aimed at middle class, but middle class that were sort of wanting on the rise to more aristocracy. So he geared it towards them with the types of subject matter in the review and about books. And he also did the Idler, which 1758 to 1760 he wrote most, other than 12 of the essays out of the 103, and he also was a big contributor to the Adventurer, which is 1752 to 1754, and that was bi-weekly. Now we've got the Connoisseur, which some of these I'm not that familiar with. I've only read little bits and pieces throughout the years because I've had collections of some of their essays. And I haven't plowed my way through all these yet. I'm getting to a point where I need a magnifying glass to read those now in the last year or so. So the Connoisseur was short-lived, weekly, in 1754, from January to September. And it was a George Coleman the Elder, and he called himself Mr. Town. And again, I think it's just the same type of thing, gossipy, purporting to be news and chatty and subject matter. The Mirror is another one, and The Lounger, which is a bit later, and these were actually done in Edinburgh. All these other ones are London-based. The Mirror and The Lounger was 1779 to 80, and Lounger 1885 to 86, and they were done in Edinburgh. And then we've got The World, which is 1753 to 1756. It was weekly, every Thursday, I think it was, by Edwin Moore. I think he was a dramatist. But that's not to be confused with, because Goldsmith put out Citizen of the World, and there are a few collections of those around. There's a folio edition of Citizen of the World. I'm not sure if it's everything, or it might be only his contributions. Then we've got The Observer, which was done in 1791, Richard Cumberland, and that was done on Sundays, and that is actually continued today with The Observer. That's every Sunday. That was the original newspaper for it. Again, I'm not 100% familiar with all of its contents. Then we go into those last three, Knox's essays. They're moral essays and literary essays. And the Ola Perdita and Microcosm, I'm not familiar with those as well, much at all, because they were actually completely new to me in these volumes. But the interesting thing is that, as I said, these were considered the best essays of all time, or 18th century especially. And the Toddler was done at coffee houses, and I showed you a coffee house book that I have in London, and this is Penny University's history of coffee houses, which is an interest of mine. But The Spectator, as I said, was run on similar lines. Now, getting back to the fact that these were considered, especially by Alexander Chalmers, who created the British Essayists, and it's been followed all the way through the 19th century for sure. There was really no question that these are the best essays. And it's still considered today by many to be the best. However, there was a lot being written at that time, a lot of periodicals. There was even a group of women. There was a female Spectator as well, which I've never actually seen anything about it. I've never read anything other than that it was short-lived, but it looks interesting. And there were other female writers who put together magazines that would be in competition to these. Usually they were just delegated to sort of household things, and religious. But there were many, mostly short-lived, from what I can gather, because I've got a book here. I couldn't find it because I was looking for it before I started the video. It's on 18th century periodical literature, and he refers to some of this material. And also with the Spectator, there were imitators all over the world. There were several. There was a Dutch version of it, which would be fascinating, but I don't believe it's ever been translated. It may not even been reprinted, but it exists. As far as I'm aware, there's still copies of it around. But also during the time, there were other periodics. I mentioned the Gentleman's Magazine, but also too, starting in the 1730s or so, is the London Magazine. It's not the same as in the sense of these, because these were small. The ones that are in here are specifically essays and small. This had fiction, it had poetry in. John Clare actually published quite a bit in the London Magazine, and it's still going today. And it's established in 1732, and it's a really great sort of general arts literature magazine / journal. And I get that every 2 months. This is February and March. It was just a whole lot of literature coming out at the time, and not just to London, not just comprised to London. There were stuff coming out, as we can see later in the 18th century, coming out in Edinburgh, and there were periodicals very similar to in the United States as well. There was newspapers, a lot of it geared towards revolutionary. I've sort of briefly looked occasionally. I would love to have a collection, something like this British Essayists, but American Essayists. I've got a few books that are sort of a history of the periodical literature of the 18th century American, but not much at all in the way of the essays. As I say, I think they'd be mostly geared towards separation, revolution, especially as it got on into the 40s, 50s, especially 60s, and during the Revolution, 1770s. But it would be interesting to see the width and breadth of the material. If anybody is aware that there is a huge set of this material, then I'd love to hear about it. Probably, if there is, it's probably something recent that's an academic press that would it'd be beyond most people's abilities to purchase. I know there's material online, and I have perused it occasionally when I get into reading this material. But yeah, so there's my 5 volumes of the British Essayists. I tried to keep this as brief as possible with some explanation for each. There's a lot more that can be talked about the Spectator, the Toddler, the Rambler, the Adventurer, and a lot of those are ones that I'm more familiar with than the others. I do want to become more familiar with the other periodicals in here, like the Connoisseur, the Lounger, the World, the Mirror, and I'm not that familiar with those, but I'm going to have to wait a little while now until I get a magnifying glass in order to read, because the writing's a little too small. With really good light, I'm not too bad with that, but my age is getting up, and I do need to get new glasses as well. But all that being said, small print's small print. But anyway, have a good reading weekend, BookTube, and I might be back later today. I've got, I think, one book that I wanted to show you, just a specific book, but I'll see how it goes for the rest of the day here, and I'll see you later.